The life-altering encounter between a billionaire and a homeless girl. He came to the cemetery the way other people came to confession, every Saturday, at the hour when fog lifts but the world hasn't yet decided whether to be kind. Elias Hartman carried lilies folded like small white flags. He always placed them with the same slow, deliberate hands, first at the footstone with the carved name, then beside the tiny marker he had ordered when the first judgments had been made and the police had closed the file. The lilies were a ritual that measured out time, one bouquet per visit, one shape of grief that could be arranged and rearranged without changing the absence that waited beneath the stone. That morning the river hummed under a low sky. Elias had been standing a long time, palms cool, a handkerchief he kept in his coat pocket dampened from a habit he no longer understood. He said the names aloud sometimes, just so the syllables wouldn't wither in his mouth. Emma, Sophie. He turned the names as if they might reveal another face. The graveyard keeper, Fred Garrison, had taught him where the softest patches of earth lay, where the wind would carry away the shouting of late ambulance sirens. Fred kept his concerns to himself, the way a taxman keeps receipts, quietly, without sentiment. And then a voice, small, abrupt, impossibly anchored to the present, broke the ritual. "They aren't dead." Elias looked up. A girl stood by the path, her coat patched at the elbows, hair a series of knots that the wind teased out. She was 11 if she was a day, some careful arithmetic told him, a child the size of a fist. She held a paper cup, emptied, the kind people used for spare coins. The cemetery's fog made her voice all the stranger, as if it were being delivered through another season. "I saw them," she said, and the words felt like stones dropped into water, each ripple colliding with something Elias had been telling himself for 18 months, that the world was whole, that the files were final, that the dates in hospital logs were truth. Elias had the reflex of a man who had read the right paragraphs in the right books, disbelief. The body of his life had been organized around loss, his company, his calendar, the single photograph he kept on his mantel of two girls laughing in the sun, hair plastered with syrup because he had insisted on pancakes that morning. The girls had disappeared. He had mourned them. The funeral had been precise and final. A note had said a hit and run, a driver at fault, a public statement from Clarissa on behalf of the family. Clarissa had said the words everyone accepted. "Who put you up to this?" Elias asked, before his caution had a chance to civilize his tone. The girl's eyes moved to the headstones. "Nobody. I sleep under the bridge. I saw them by a gray house, red door, by the river. They were playing. They had the same song your older one sings. Your girl drops her head when she laughs." It was a ridiculous specificity, and the kind that lodged in the chest. Elias had watched Sophie drop her head the way a small bird might tuck in wing. He had watched Emma trace circles with her fork at breakfast, leaving syrup moons on the plate. The details, absurd and domestic, shifted the balance from impossible to merely improbable. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amani." She pronounced it as though it might be borrowed against a future. She looked at him directly, and there was no expectancy in the look, only the economy of someone who had learned early when asking would be more costly than silence. Elias felt, for the first time in months, an old stubbornness to act. They stood there for a fullness of minutes where the world around them held its breath. The lilies rested on the stone like a promise. The river continued its patient work of making the city forget itself. "Stay with me," Elias said to Amani before he could correct himself that it read like a bargain. "Tell me what you saw." She told him. She told him about a night 2 months ago, how she had been scavenging under the bridge and had seen children run across a side path, how one had dropped a small plastic bracelet that glinted like candy. She could say where the gray house stood in relation to the old boatyard, what the red paint looked like, a flaking, stubborn kind of red, and that the front garden had more dirt than grass, and that sometimes the back gate was unlatched when she was there in the afternoons. She spoke with the spare truth of someone cataloging escape routes. When she finished, Elias felt like a diver who had returned to the surface too quickly. The air burned. That night, he went home and almost did not sleep. He unfolded the photograph of the two girls and pressed the handkerchief into the paper for the warmth to make the image softer, like a bruise gone pale. He had a name in his pocket now, as damning as a key. If the cemetery had been the old world where grief kept steady pace, what followed was the dangerous territory of a man with money trying to make the world answer again. Elias Hartman was not a man who called police and waited. He had learned, over 3 decades, what money could do. It could open doors and close reputations. It could buy time and buy privacy. But it could not call back what had been lost. That morning, he called the first line he trusted. Thomas Knight arrived in a sedan with a low profile, the kind of vehicle that looked like it wanted to be somewhere else. Thomas was a man built to look unremarkable. Square jaw, quiet eyes, a voice that did not announce itself. He had been Elias's shadow for as long as Elias needed one. Sometimes he was a chauffeur. Sometimes he was a presence. Sometimes he was the kind of private detective who could make a chain of possession look like a polite conversation. Thomas listened first. He did not ask for proof, because proof is often a coward.
He asked questions the way a man sets hooks. What time did the girl say she saw them? How sure was she? Who else is around that stretch of river? Then, when the list was long enough, he said, "We check property records, social accounts, utility trails. We ask the boatyard for deliveries. We keep it quiet. You already told anyone?" Elias thought of Clarissa. He thought of what telling could mean once the world knew there might have been a lie. Clarissa had been elegant in her grief, his ex-wife in the way that domestic tragedies turn strangers into historical artifacts. She had managed images and statements with the clinical skill of someone who had rehearsed the world in which she would exist after the emergency. The files had said the girls were dead. The city had been properly sorry. No, he had not told anyone. Not yet, he said. Not even June. June had been with the family since before Elias had closed his first major deal. She could make coffee that tasted like a porch at dawn, and she had the vocabulary of maternity in the way she prepared lunchboxes and folded shirts with the tenderness of a ritual priest. Elias dialed her number before Thomas left his driveway. The voice on the line was immediate and gentle, a hand offering him the seam of a story he could not stitch alone. "Don't go scrambling," June said. "You promise me you won't go crying at doors." "I won't," he lied by omission. He had in mind a single thing, a gray house, a red door. He had the grammar of ritual. He lacked the 2 syllables that would make it legal. So he pivoted to what he could do. Get people who could find whether this city had kept his daughters under a different name in a different fiction. By noon, Marcus Bell had been folded into the map of people Elias needed. Marcus was a family attorney who had been in the business of retrieving children long enough to know how emotion observed the law. His voice was steady the way a court stenographer's is steady, slanted toward precision. "Emergency custody can be filed," Marcus said, "but it needs probable cause. We can't file on feelings. We need something the court recognizes. A witness credible enough that a judge will sign a temporary order allowing immediate possession and protective custody." "Amani is credible," Elias said. He had the taste of proof in him now, the way a father has spent months rewriting his life on the assumption of absence, then discovers an error. She said, "Children in the street are not unknown to the court," Marcus interrupted gently. "We need corroboration. Pictures, delivery records, a third-party witness. Anything that ties those names to that place." This was the legal scaffolding. It felt like waiting for a scaffold to appear around a fall, necessary, functional, and utterly inadequate to the vertigo Elias felt. Still, the law required patience, so they would build evidence, property records, bills, surveillance. Thomas had a plan. Marcus said he could get a judge to look at an affidavit if Thomas could bring in real corroboration. Danielle Mercer, a media strategist with haircut like a straight blade and the patience of someone who had loved reputations into white gloves, made a different list. "You have to assume Clarissa will go public," she told Elias in the study one evening, where street lamp light made the books look like islands. "How much do you want to control? If we go silent and they leak, you look secretive. If you speak too soon and it splashes, you look reactive. You need a statement a week from now that frames you as concerned parent, not as revenge-seeking mogul." Elias realized, for the first time in months, he felt like a man learning to breathe again. He had an enemy that might be false, a girl on the street who had become a key, a legal system that required evidence, and a PR map that suggested image could kill truth faster than any malfeasance ever could. But he also had the skeleton of action. Thomas set up licensed surveillance with a firm that used visible cams, legal vantage points, a camera on a municipal lamppost, interviews with neighbors, queries for utility bills under the name on the mailbox. The smallness of it soothed Elias. Motion sensors and legal affidavits had a logic he could grasp. Amani agreed to take them to the rough coordinates she had memorized like a hymn. She walked ahead of them, small as a promise, moving with the confidence of someone who knew how to avoid notice. The riverside path smelled of salt and rust, and the gray house crouched near the boatyard like a secret reclaiming itself. Its paint was tired, flaking like old bruises. The red door had once been fierce and now managed only a stubborn streak of color. There were laundry lines sagging and a back gate that leaned. Finger press marks showed where hands had left oil. Elias's breath shortened. This was a place that belonged to a chapter he had not known existed. "Who's there?" a voice called from inside, young, sharp, an alarm bell. A woman appeared at the window and then pulled back like someone who had practiced retreat. Amani's jaw tightened and she turned to Thomas in a way that said, without words, "Don't." They did not cross the threshold. Thomas rode the precaution of a professional who knew how to make information into leverage without becoming an aggressor. He recorded the house's address, took photos from a distance that was legal and polite. He asked the nearest neighbor about last week's garbage collection, the frequency of the children's laughter. A middle-aged man with a newspaper and the kind of suspicion that comes from living too long in one place gave them a detail. Trash on the curb, a box for Clarion Holdings, a property management company whose name kept appearing in the records when Thomas dug into the chain of ownership. Clarion, Thomas repeated into his recorder. Shell or management? We'll find out. Inside the house, through an open kitchen window, Elias thought he saw movement, a figure half-sized, a flash of blue hair ribbon. He forced himself not to rush, to breathe, to remember Marcus's words. You need corroboration. You need probable cause. He felt ridiculous and small enough to be human again. The handkerchief in his pocket was a pebble of memory. He wrapped his fingers around it until the fabric warmed. The legal and tactical work came together like a machine in that first week. Thomas found an old lease under a name he didn't recognize. The property had been shuffled through a small network of trusts. Marcus began preparing a packet, affidavits, a timeline, a request for temporary custody pending an investigation. Danielle drafted a statement that Elias refused to accept until he had the phrase, "My daughter's in it," and nothing else that read like a corporate paragraph. June made pancakes that Saturday and set 2 plates at a table with syrup cooling into rings because Elias had always believed, absurdly, that small rituals could teach hearts how to return. Amani spent the first few days within the orbit of Elias's estate like a comet. She accepted sandwiches and socks and a corner sofa as if they were things she'd always known how to hold. She told them more, about the bracelet, about the way one of the girls had banged her knee on a step, and how a woman, possibly Clarissa, had cleaned it with a handkerchief that had paisley on the edge. She hums when she patches things, Amani said, and the sound that rose from the past in Elias's mind was the kind of small hum his daughters had bestowed on domestic boredom. Amani was not a perfect witness. She occasionally forgot where she'd put a scrap of information, or she contradicted herself in the way that happens when memory rubs against fear. But she had an honesty that did not always need corroboration, a child's naming of a detail that could be checked. Thomas and Marcus turned those minor truths into threads. The first night, the surveillance team left a camera aimed toward the back garden of the gray house. Elias sat alone in his study and watched a grainy feed on his laptop. The image was legal and exacting. A sliver of backyard, a swing set the size of a skeleton, the red door like a flat heartache. He left a cup of coffee untouched and ran his fingers along the edge of the handkerchief in his lap. Images came at him like small weather events. People moving, the occasional dog, a laundry basket tipped over. He felt himself revert to old habits. Cataloging, noting, trying to contain. "Don't get attached to pixels," Thomas said over the phone when Elias called at 2 a.m, the feed glowing like distant streetlights. "We wait. We collect." The days folded into each other. Marcus worked the court channels. He filed a motion under a statute that allowed a judge to grant temporary possession where there existed a credible claim that children were in danger or in someone else's fraudulent care. The judge assigned to the case had a reputation for patience. Marcus liked that. Patience did not mean indecision. It meant the preservation of order in a world where order had been fragmented. Danielle managed the first leak with the press. A reporter sniffed at the story, as reporters will when their noses pick up the faintest whiff of scandal. A billionaire grieving father who may have been lied to by the mother he had trusted. Danielle briefed Elias to remain the careful father, to avoid public accusatory language. "We don't want Clarissa getting to define herself as a victim," she said. "She already knows how to tell a story." He trusted her. He trusted Thomas and Marcus. He trusted the music of process, the way forms and affidavits could be assembled into an argument the world could understand. And yet the kernel of the thing, Amani's single, stubborn whisper, remained stubbornly strange. He kept expecting a revelation, an error, some reason to fold the afternoon back into ordinary bereavement. The city, obligingly, remained stubbornly rich in ambiguity. The first real break came in a way both petty and perfect. A discarded lunchbox, softened by sun and refuse, lay half-buried behind a fence near the boatyard. It had a cartoon spaceship sticker on its lid, the kind of sticker that parents lose in the year between first grade and second grade. Thomas photographed it, ran a trace, and the sticker's manufacturer sent back a batch number. The batch number led to a chain of school supply purchases made online under a name Thomas had not expected, S. Hale. The name hit like a bell. Clarissa's maiden name was public history, but a current alias suggested movement, an attempt to make an identity that did not carry weight. Thomas found a string of small purchases, children's vitamins, a packet of hair ribbons, and an occasional mail-order book, sent to the gray house and billed to a corporate alias. A pattern emerged. Small domestic orders, the sort of items a family might need, delivered to a place that had no public link to Elias. Elias felt something like hope, which is a dangerous thing when unseasoned by reason. Marcus prepared another affidavit. They now had physical objects, third-party witnesses, the dockhand who had seen 2 small figures running, procurement trails, and the testimony of a child who was willing to speak on the stand if required. That night, Elias called Clarissa. He did not expect a confession. He expected what he had always understood from the woman he had once loved, composure as an art form. She answered on the second ring. "Eli," she said, with a syllable that still made him picture the hallway of their first house, the smell of lemon and coffee, the small chaos of 2 children's lives. Her voice was measured. "You called at a bad time." He did not mention the bricks of evidence. He asked only one thing. "Are Emma and Sophie alive?" There was a long silence. He imagined, absurdly, the sound of a pen stopping mid-ink. Clarissa's voice, when it returned, was a careful instrument.
"They are safe," she said. "They are not with me." The evasiveness was both a taunt and a refusal. Elias felt the room grow small. He measured his words with care that night when he told Marcus. "She did not say no," he said. "She didn't say yes, either," Marcus said, more sober than Elias would have liked. They proceeded. They moved closer to that legal threshold, probable cause assembled by a set of facts that would be painful to deny in court. Thomas's surveillance feed, their procurement chain, the dock worker's testimony, Amani's witness. Each piece was a stone in a structure that might, if the judge agreed, be solid enough to permit removal. Elias learned to be patient in striated ways, to look away from a grainy image for an hour, to let Marcus write submissions and then read them again until the rhythm of the argument felt inevitable. June cooked dinners that smelled of home and gave him a face in the steam. Amani slept on a sofa with a blanket marine-scented, and in the morning she would be the first at the table, eyes bright, insisting on pancakes with syrup and the economy of butter. Elias taught her how to set a table like a ritual, and, in the process, found himself promising things to two absent people who were, at the moment, a question mark. Then, on a wet Thursday afternoon, when the sky was the color of old photographs, the camera caught movement in the gray house's back garden. Two small figures, a blanket of motion only partly resolved by the camera's angle, a child's head bowed over, yes, a bracelet that flashed like a small, honest thing. Thomas sent a cautious message: possible presence, obtain confirmation. Elias watched the clip on a monitor in a room lit by a single lamp. The images were grainy, the way memory often is, but one shape, smaller, moving with the awkward grace of a child who is unused to a large open space, bore a gesture he could not mistake. A head dipped. It was the same tilt Elias's daughter had made when she laughed, the very movement Amani had described at the cemetery. "Play it again," Elias said. The laptop obliged. The video raced forward and then stuttered, a frame dropping like a hitch in a breath. Thomas's face on the other end of the line was a study in control. "We don't confront until we have a documentary-level chain," he said. "We risk legal trouble if we go grabbing children without a judge's order." Elias felt the pressure of the world focusing on a narrow point. He wanted to run to the gate and pry it open with his hands. He wanted to knock and demand, as if ownership of a name was as simple as turning a key. But he had a court to convince. He had to make the state's machinery see what he saw, and the state's machinery required different kinds of proof. Marcus prepared the motion in an almost ritual way. He laid out the chain: witness statement, Amani; material corroboration, the lunchbox; procurement chain, billed items; direct sighting, surveillance clip. He wrote succinctly, not melodramatically, because the law does not care for feeling as much as it cares for the tactile: dates, signatures, and verified sources. Elias signed the initial affidavits as if signing a new contract, one not with money, but with hope. The judge read fast and decided faster than Elias dared to hope. A temporary order was signed late into the evening, authorizing immediate action to place the two children into protective custody pending further investigation. It was not a verdict. It was a knot in a rope that might, for a moment, hold them both. They moved at dusk because the court orders that save lives rarely announce themselves with trumpets. A small, discreet team assembled: Thomas, Marcus, two social workers from Child Protective Services, and a uniformed officer who would keep the formality intact for a court later. Elias did not go to the door. Marcus insisted. "You do not want to be the person who walks into a child custody scene with your face in every camera," he said. "Let the process speak. Let the law deliver the line for us." Amani walked beside them, small but composed. She had been given a thermal blanket because the night had teeth. The social worker spoke in a voice that was more pastoral than professional when she told Amani she had done something brave. Amani's reply was spare.
They needed someone, she said, and the words felt like a bell rung in a chapel. They knocked. The door opened a crack, as if it had been waiting for permission. An older woman, harried and "please don't be here," met them at the threshold. Her face was a map of small compromises. "There's a court order," Marcus said, voice practiced and careful. He held up the paper like a talisman. The woman faltered. She had the look of someone who had used denial as an architectural plan. There was no cinematic scream. There was instead a long, thin moment where the backyard delivered two small bodies into the twilight. One found the fence and climbed with the clumsy determination of a child who has practiced fear into muscle memory. Neither child screamed. One of them, a girl with hair like two small planets, turned and looked. She blinked at the faces, at the uniforms, and then, because the world is not made of filmic crescendos but of small, honest recognition, her shoulders lowered, as if someone had unknotted a ribbon in her chest. Elias had been told to stay away. He was in his car, reporting the scene by phone. Marcus placed a hand over his shoulder, as if it were a map pointing to what the night demanded: patience. The social worker wrapped the children in blankets and asked names.
Imani stood at the periphery, face unreadable. The two girls were bewildered, suspicious, and in that order. "Your name?" the social worker asked the older. "Emma," the older said slowly. Her voice had oatmeal in it, coarse and basic. "And the other?" "Sophie." The names traveled along the line of people like electricity finding the right wire. Marcus's face, until then a ledger of legal caution, relaxed enough for Elias to think he might cry. But then the first of many small formalities arrived. Questions about custody were asked in the flat voice of people who had seen joy unpack itself into chaos too many times to be sentimental. Child Protective Services took statements. Officers made a report. They were careful and painfully bureaucratic, the kind of attention that is both a balm and a blade. Elias's first sight of them later that night was through a small glassed visitation room, the sort of space designed to allow presence without irrevocable error. He could see them seated at a low table, hands in syruped positions, a television turned to a dull educational program. Emma looked up. When she met his eyes, something like recognition stepped out from under dust. She swallowed, and then, absurdly, she reached for the handkerchief he kept in his coat and placed it on the table between them, a small, knotted thing with paisley at the edge. He recognized it because Clarissa had had one like it, because things he had associated with his daughters sometimes revolved in his pockets. The handkerchief was a cipher that connected two lives. Elias slid the glass between them and touched his palm to the pane. She brought her small fingers to the other side, and for an instant they were separated by nothing but a sheet of tempered glass. He wanted to tell them everything. He wanted to say he had been looking for them for a year and a half. He wanted to promise pancakes 1,000 times over. But the room required patience. The social worker, with a steady throat, told him they had to proceed legally. An intake evaluation, medical, a forensic interview that protected the children. Marcus's reassuring hand in the doorway was a reminder that the world's machinery had to be allowed to do its cautious work. Elias walked away that night feeling like a man whose prayers had been answered in the grammar of an unfamiliar religion. He wanted to pick them up and rearrange the past. He wanted to call Clarissa and ask, with the clarity of a man who had found his children, what had been done and why. Instead, he took a breath and allowed Marcus and Thomas to do their work. The next morning, the world turned, and with it came an immediate countercurrent: public attention. Clarissa's statement was precise and raw. She described a life that had been complicated by fear, by a decision made in a moment of desperation. She called for privacy. She called for compassion for all involved. For a day, the press circled like gulls. Danielle's plan worked only in part. Some outlets built a narrative that painted Elias as the billionaire who had failed, a man whose wealth had been the mechanism not of protection, but of erasure. Others painted Clarissa as a woman who had done what she thought necessary.
Elias sat through a dozen interviews he did not give. He watched a soup of headlines and speculation. He read the articles that called him the absent father and those that called him the savior. He felt, under the layer of legal and newsy detail, a loom of something more dangerous, an idea that truth could be shaped by who spoke loudest. Meanwhile, the discovery of the handkerchief in Emma's possession led to a minor forensic inquiry that Marcus oversaw with the exactness of a scholar. It had threads of paisley printed precisely like a cloth from a house Clarissa had once visited. Small evidence connected to small evidence. The chain was not miraculous, but it was evidence nonetheless. The court had allowed the temporary custodial seizure. Now the question was criminal intent. Had Clarissa faked their deaths? Had she arranged papers, or had someone else manufactured the fiction? The answers came not in a single flash, but in a series of small blows. A mailbox subscription turned up a name associated with a shell business, Clarion Holdings, linked through a web of nominal officers. Small purchases turned into a paper trail that suggested a pattern of simulated domestic life, a name on a lease that was not Clarissa's public name. Conspiracies have to be built on mundane acts, filing a document, signing a receipt. Evidence dripped slow and sure into Marcus's files. And then, as if the story needed a reminder that victory tends to arrive with a cost, the first threat arrived. It was not dramatic. It came in a nondescript black envelope left in the estate's outer mailbox, 2 photographs and a note. The photographs were close-ups, grainy, and taken from an angle that suggested someone had been watching the car at night. One image showed Elias's car leaving the hospital the night of Emma and Sophie's supposed deaths, an ordinary thing, except the angle implied proximity. The other showed him, older and thin around the eyes, entering a private jet terminal years earlier. The note was typed, "You cannot buy back what is gone." Elias ran his fingers over the paper as if he could warm it. He had friends who had met threats with lawsuits, with dismissive letters, with PR campaigns. Marcus frowned. "We document, we report, we don't dramatize," he said. "We log and we escalate." But the envelope had done something more dangerous than its words. It made Elias feel watched in a way no press cycle could instill. The implication was simple. Someone knew not only where his life intersected with the city, but where his movement lay. It suggested eyes in the sunshine and shadow in his privacy. He had resources, he had people who could find the sender. But the sender had a talent for message. Thomas took the envelope and left it in his pocket like a hot coal. He tightened the security at the estate and told Elias to be careful with whom he spoke. Marcus filed an anonymous harassment report. Danielle drafted a second statement for the public that called for calm and asked the press to respect the children's privacy. Elias felt the world tighten around him like hands he had not invited. Amani watched it all with a sort of careful indifference. She had provided the whisper that changed everything, and yet she understood, probably better than anyone, that small things rarely end cleanly. She had lived by the river long enough to know the economy of threats. An envelope means someone cares, and someone who cares can also hurt. She had no illusions about protection. She had only the odd loyalty that attached itself to adults who had done right by her. One evening, Thomas came back from an errand and found Amani on the back steps with a small wooden box in her lap. She had found it in the boatyard trash. Inside, wrapped in a film of greasy paper, was a child's trinket, a bracelet with a star charm and one bead missing. The bead Elias recognized from their photographs, a small blue bead one of their daughters had loved. He felt his throat close. "Keep it," Amani said. "If it's theirs, keep it." They kept it in a small velvet pouch in Thomas's desk, a piece of evidence and a piece of home. It was a talisman and a piece of paper. It was all Elias had in that moment that was not process. He began to collect small domestic promises. Pancakes for mornings when the world would again allow a routine. Bedtime stories, a wisteria he would plant near the courtyard when the house could afford the softness. But the life-altering encounter, the whisper, was no simple redemption. Someone had been watching their movements as carefully as they had watched the gray house. Surveillance begets surveillance. Evidence beget backlash. Clarissa's half-sister, Margot Vell, began to appear in the background of inquiries. An odd, difficult woman who seemed to prefer the indirect currency of influence. Margot had a way of looking at a file like a person appraising a painting, not to destroy, only to know how it might hang. A week after the custody order, a man arrived at the river in a raincoat and a blank face. He was not much to look at. His name, Raymond Leach, came with a reputation for being a fixer, someone who could make inconvenient things fade and make inconvenient people recant. Marcus identified him in a public database. Thomas trails him, a shadow among shadows, the way a predator studies the way prey moves. Raymond moved carefully, leaving no breadcrumb trail that Thomas could easily follow. But he left, like all men who move in the gray spaces, a pattern. He liked to be useful to people who paid him to tidy. Elias realized, with a queasy clarity, the world was changing from an internal geography of grief to an external one composed of enemies and paperwork. Each thing he did to recover his children invited a response. Each response had a cost. The handkerchief on the child's table was a bridge. The black envelope in his mailbox was a statement of intent. The presence of people like Margot and Raymond suggested deeper currents, a network with motives that were at once banal and wicked. They had found the girls. The law had given Elias the temporary custody that made reunion possible. But the discovery had only peeled back a skin. Beneath lay a longer tissue of complicity and secrecy. On a late autumn afternoon, the surveillance camera captured an image that would alter the particular rhythm of their days. It was not glamorous. It did not feature a dramatic confrontation in a park. It was instead a small phone video recorded by someone who had knocked on the wrong door and recorded what they found. In that grainy frame, a woman, Margot, stood at the edge of the boatyard, her face turned away from the camera, a half-light on her jaw. She lifted a phone to her ear and did not speak, or if she did, the microphone did not pick it up. Thomas replayed the clip until his jaw hardened. "She's watching," he said. "She knows more than we do." Elias felt the tilt of the world at that line. Someone had turned from being a name in the margins to a person whose attention could rattle the house like wind through a loose window pane. He no longer felt that Margot was a rumor. She was someone who arranged angles in the dark and smiled at the light. They shifted their posture. Thomas tightened routes for entry and exit around the estate. Marcus spoke to the assistant DA, Lillian Cortez, a woman whose courtroom bearings were the hard polish of someone who had watched too many lives turn on brittle facts. Lillian read their materials with a patience that felt almost personal. The lunchbox trail, the batch number, the surveillance clip, the handkerchief. When Thomas slid the black envelope across the table and Marcus set the velvet pouch containing the bracelet beside it, Lillian's eyes narrowed in a way that suggested the shape of intent. "We need more than breadcrumbs," she said. "We need the loaf. We need to show that the concealment of the children was purposeful and that a conspiracy exists beyond ordinary dodging." The prosecution would rely on threads woven together: a child's witness, corroboration from mundane objects, financial footprints, and, if they could obtain it, a recorded transaction when one conspirator paid another. In other words, the law wanted human motion captured broadly enough to be undeniable. Thomas found the loaf in an unexpected place, a public records office where clerks, under the bland light of municipal fluorescence, signed and stamped as if signatures were ritual and stamps were sacraments. He had a contact there who owed him a favor, and in a pile of archived property transfers, came across a notation that should not have been. A clerk's hurried scrawl tied a mailing address to a notary who had signed off on an administrative death notice. The notary's name had surfaced elsewhere, a minor contractor who had been paid for paperwork by a shell company tied to Clarion Holdings. Once they had the notary, once they had a public signature to match a supposedly official death notice, the forensic team moved in. Marcus delivered documents to a forensic document examiner who compared paper, ink, and signature cadence. It is not an instant magic, but a patient science. The way an expert listens to the texture of a voice and notices the slightest tremor. The examiner reported back that the notices bore inconsistencies, different letterhead fonts layered, an official stamp whose ink composition did not match municipal stock. In simpler terms, they had proof that documents had been manufactured to look official. Lillian filed the complaint. She pursued subpoenas for Clarion's bank accounts and for the mobile phone records connected to Margot Vell and to a number registered to a man named Raymond Leach. She moved slowly so that the motion would not be beaten back on technicalities. Marcus walked a narrow bridge between eager disclosure and legal prudence. "We do not rush the law," he told Elias in the gentle, blunt way of a man who had learned the cost of haste. "We let it build a case that will stand up in front of a jury." The media had their own timetable. Clarissa, while under investigation, defended herself with an interview in which she spoke of terror and a decision made under the pressure of fear. Her voice had a weariness that some heard as sincerity and others heard as calculation. Danielle, the PR strategist, argued they needed to control the narrative by centering the children's welfare. Elias gave a short statement. He would not inflame, he would not be theatrical, he would insist only on the truth and the children's safety. It did not satisfy everyone, but it kept the focus where it needed to be. Threats continued. Envelopes arrived with photographs from obscure angles. Someone left a folded cloth at the estate gate with the initials CH drawn in ink that might have been Clarissa's. The courthouse itself became a stage on which small intimations of menace were performed. Anonymous emails, a call to Marcus's home phone that hung up after a breathless sigh. Thomas traced what he could and reported patterns. Someone watched for movement, called to see where Elias might be, tested the seams. Raymond's name appeared more often in the shadows. An intermediary who could arrange transportation, who could find a place to hide children, who liked to keep accounts in cash. Margot was the broker, Raymond was the muscle and logistics.
Thomas's investigative work adopted a new rhythm, patience interlaced with sudden bursts of controlled activity. They needed to draw Margot out into public with evidence that would place her in possession of forged documents and of the hidden children's things, the bracelet, the lunchbox, the paisley handkerchief. But they could not simply manufacture a bait and hope. The law required lawful surveillance and lawful capture. Lillian's team prepared a warrant that would allow them to execute a search and seize any papers, devices, or money that tied Margot to Clarion or to Raymond. It was Marcus who suggested a pivot that felt less dramatic than it proved to be. "We can't wait for them to come to us," he said. "We need to pull them into the light in a way that looks ordinary." The plan was simple in description. A decoy courier would deliver a packed box to a drop point Margot frequented, an anonymous gate at a community garden used by boatyard workers. The box would contain innocuous items with embedded tracking and would be scheduled to be picked up by a courier who would appear as if by happenstance. The goal was to get Margot to handle the box in the open where Thomas could film and where the DA's officers could move where they needed to. "Lawful, visible, and recorded," Lillian affirmed. "We do not engage in entrapment. We only create a lawful opportunity to observe." They set the trap on a gray Thursday in late November when the river's breath made the air thin. Amani offered to show Thomas and the courier the route. She knew the boatyard paths like the inside of a pocket. She would not be a bait. She walked clear of the appointed time, but her knowledge shaped the plan in ways that mattered. The courier was a young woman with a trucker's cap and a friendly way that did not invite suspicion. Thomas watched the live feed on a laptop in a parked van across from the pickup point. Marcus and Lillian stood in an unremarkable sedan 2 blocks away, waiting for the warrant to be signed and the moment to arrive. Margot came with a friend who had the habitual ease of someone used to being allowed to cross lines. She took the box, hands practiced, eyes flicking. The camera caught her face as she brushed dirt from the lid and opened it. Inside, beneath a layer of packing, lay a child's jacket, a small red comb, and, placed almost casually, a letter-sized envelope with the Clarion letterhead. The letter was a ruse, a trap. Inside, printed on official paper, was a draft of a fictionalized transfer agreement with a scrawl in the margin, Margot's handwriting, later matched by an expert who compared it to prior court filings. It was sufficient probable cause. Lillian's officers stepped from their vehicle. Thomas radioed. The van's doors opened, and men in plain jackets moved as if they'd been rehearsing this choreography for months. Margot did not surrender quietly.
She dropped the box as if it were heavier than it was, and moved to toss something into a bin. Marcus, by prior arrangement, read the rights into his small recorder as the police performed a lawful arrest. The strength of the case was not in one thing, it was in the way the small pieces coalesced. Officers found 2 mobile phones with messages to Raymond about pickups and about payments. They recovered a small notebook that contained names and an account number for Clarion. They found a receipt for a notarization. All of it was cataloged and sealed in evidence bags. When the news hit the estate, when Thomas called Elias and Marcus told him Margot had been detained, Elias felt a relief of the kind that drained color from the world. "It's not over," Marcus told him, as if reading a manual he had written about pain. "It's a step." Margot's arrest led investigators to a different thread. Under questioning and with her lawyer present, she eventually admitted to arranging housing and lines of credit for people connected to Clarion and to helping coordinate pickups and drop-offs in return for money. She insisted, to whatever audience listened, that she had believed the children had been legally relinquished. Her voice was not one of a monstrous schemer, but of someone whose moral calculus had been simplified by need. Still, the paper trail existed. Margot's willingness to talk produced a location Raymond had used for a few weeks to store items, the corridor of his operations. Raymond's capture took a different choreography. He was not the kind to meet in open light. He moved between safe houses and took cues from rumor. Thomas and the DA used the phone records and surveillance to find a pattern, and a warrant allowed them to enter one of Raymond's known storage spaces, where agents found a lockbox containing passports, cash, and documents with the names of the girls hidden inside. It was not the spectacle of a confession so much as the dull finality of fingerprints on paper, and of a financial ledger that could be traced back to Clarion accounts. With Margot and Raymond in custody, the prosecution closed a loop. Lillian took the evidence to a grand jury. It is a tedious, kinetic thing, law in its state of patient machinery. But when the grand jury returned its indictment, the charges were clear: conspiracy to defraud and to conceal children, false instruments, and related counts. Clarissa, after consultation and counsel, was indicted as well for her alleged role in orchestrating the paperwork that made the concealment plausible. The arraignment was subdued in the legal way things are when motion meets shadow. Clarissa's face in the gallery, now in custody, and later under monitoring as she awaited trial, was not a mask of theatrical villainy. She listened to the charges with a look that was at once exhausted and composure ruled. The defense argued procedural errors and the possibility of misunderstandings, while Lillian argued the weight of the material facts. The fabricated death notices, the payments routed through shell companies, the patterns of deliveries. The legal theater that followed was careful. Documents were authenticated through forensic examiners. Emails were produced with metadata intact. Bank transfers were subpoenaed with a clarity that no one could argue was misty. They built the narrative in court as one might build a bridge, plank by plank, witness by witness. Amani was not called to appear before the jury. She had given her statement to the authorities and had spoken in a protected environment for the records. The prosecution relied instead on the surveillance clips, on the forensic document examiner who likened the forged death notices to a counterfeit currency,
On Margot's own testimony, given under careful cross-examination, which placed Clarissa at the center of the means by which the children's lives had been concealed. There was a moment in the courtroom when a small stack of receipts was produced. Hair ribbons, children's books, school supply invoices, all billed to shell entities under Clarion's control and delivered to addresses connected to Margot and Raymond. The jury saw invoices, matched them to images of the gray house, and watched as the needle of probability moved steadily toward intent. Clarissa's defense made an appeal to a human story: fear, fractured relationships, a woman who had felt cornered by a custody decision and who had panicked. Panic is not a crime, her lawyer said. He attempted to separate intention to harm from intention to protect. But the law, in its slow arithmetic, required that protection be legitimate and not based on invented death certificates and falsified municipal records. Evidence, not just motive, mattered. When the verdict came, guilty on several counts, the sound in the gallery was muffled. Elias felt a faint surge, as if gravity had moved a fraction, then steadied. Clarissa's sentence would be determined later. The immediate victory for the Hartman family was procedural. The court affirmed Elias's custodial rights. The judge's language was careful and sober, acknowledging the gravity of a parent's right to children and the complicity of individuals who had obscured that right. The practical aftermath required more attention than the courtroom drama had warranted. Social workers walked the Hartman estate, with checklists tempered by compassion. They recommended a familiar place placement. Elias's home would be the setting where the girls would live while further evaluations proceeded. There were protocols: trauma-informed therapy, limited media exposure, school transitions handled at a pace recommended by clinicians. Marcus navigated the legal forms to ensure that the children's privacy would be protected from curiosity-hungry outlets. He obtained restraining orders where necessary and filed motions to seal parts of the record to keep the children's names out of headlines. Amani, who had been the catalyst and who had earned a place in Elias's orbit, faced her own legal pathway. She had no guardian, and the state prepared to place her temporarily. Elias and Marcus discussed guardianship with the social services team. The argument in favor was both humane and practical. Amani had shown remarkable steadiness. She had placed herself in harm's way for reasons of honesty and had adapted to a domestic environment with an ease that suggested belonging. The social worker, a woman named Rosa who smelled faintly of lemon oil and coffee, recommended a family-placed arrangement while long-term plans were evaluated. The court, recognizing the children's best interest and the supportive domestic environment, approved Elias's petition for temporary guardianship pending a full assessment. The house, once a mausoleum of grief in Elias's memory, accepted life like light through a new pane. Small domestic rituals began to stitch seams. Jittery breakfasts where pancakes congealed into shapes that promised repetition and safety. Bedtime readings that required Elias's voice to modulate between softness and authority. June's hands moving like liturgy in the kitchen as she learned new recipes that suited more mouths. The wisteria, still a plan in Elias's mind, was purchased in a small burlap-wrapped root and kept in the greenhouse. Elias and June planted it together on a crisp weekend when the sky was a pale, forgiving blue. They dug a hole and folded in soil, and when the first rooted tendril took, Elias felt a small kind of promising ache. Therapy was ordinary and irregular in the good sense. The children met with clinicians who used play and gentle inquiry rather than question lists. Emma and Sophie, whose temperaments were different as the two lines in a pair of knitting needles, revealed their interiors slowly. Sophie with her sudden dramatic silences, Emma with cautious observation that pierced like a small persistent light. Amani, who had been both a witness and a survivor, found a counselor who recognized her audacity and taught her tools for dealing with sudden intrusion or fear. The clinicians did not promise erasure, they offered scaffolding. There were also small injuries that did not make headlines. Trust missteps, nights when a familiar household noise made one child bolt from sleep, the way a camera shutter in a news photograph could make a child fold inward. Marcus and Lillian worked to keep the family's privacy intact. Danielle planted a garden of controlled statements and closed interviews, aiming for a thin stream of empathy rather than an all-consuming blaze. Elias learned to be present in ways that had been foreign to him.
He learned to call less for errands and more for attendance. He read the same book for 3 nights because it took Sophie that long to allow the sound of his voice to be trustworthy. He made pancakes every Saturday and kept a record. Syrup rings on a notepad where each day someone had left a small doodle. It was not heroic, it was necessary. Amani's integration followed its own arc. The legal processes would take months. In the meantime, she attended school with the girls, learned to pronounce their teachers' names, accepted an old sweater from June as if it were armor, and, on clear afternoons, helped plant the wisteria's trellis posts. She refused to be fixed into the role of rescuer. She accepted the title the family offered her: friend, witness, important. Elias, who had been a man of transactions and contracts for most of his public life, found a new kind of accounting in small, repeated gestures. There were quieter reckonings, too. Margot, when interviewed in custody, talked of a woman she had once envied and then feared. Clarissa was not a simple monster, she said, but someone who had panicked when cornered. Raymond remained infuriatingly blunt, a man who regarded moral calculus as a ledger. In prison visiting rooms, humanizing details emerged that complicated the story but did not absolve the actions. The legal consequences were real: sentences for Margot and Raymond, restitution orders where possible, and a conviction for Clarissa that would shadow her life for years. The media cycle, which had been a feeding thing hungry for shape, found itself starved for new sensation. Stories of the Hartman children evolved from scandal to a quieter human interest thread. Pieces on the difficulty of reuniting families, on the role of private investigators, on the ethics of media intrusion. Some reporters were chastened by their coverage. A few were humbled and wrote follow-up pieces asking how lives might be rebuilt. A small public moment occurred at a community fundraiser months later, a tent by the river where families and neighbors gathered. The Hartmans attended in a modest way, preferring not to dominate the space. They bought tickets for a slow carousel whose horses had paint worn like old promises. The girls went on the ride with Amani. The carousel's music was tinny and bright. The 3 of them laughed, tentative at first, then as if testing the elasticity of joy. June watched from the sidelines with a thermos of coffee and an expression of someone learning to trust motion again. It was not all triumph. Old habits die slowly. Elias would wake at the hour he once kept for sorrow and find the morning quiet and then, gradually, the sound of breakfast. He would go to the study and find children's drawings thumbtacked to the bulletin board, like flags of small victories. He would read them the same way he once read contracts: careful, oriented, aware of obligations. There remained legal arcs: restitution hearings, post-conviction motions, and restraining orders. Clarissa, in a final hearing, gave an account that was fragmented and human. A woman who had lived out of fear and had made unconscionable choices. The judge balanced punishment with consideration of mental state and sentenced accordingly, noting the harm done and the need for accountability. Margot and Raymond were also sentenced. Their time in custody would be part of a slower, public reckoning. Elias did not celebrate. He did small, steady work. He taught Emma to tie her shoes. He read Sophie a book about a small moon who had trouble finding its place. He taught Amani how to butter toast evenly. They went to a therapist together once as a family, and sometimes in separate rooms to speak in ways the others would not overhear. The therapist praised the consistency of small rituals and cautioned that recovery would be uneven. The children, shielded from intrusive media, were allowed to be children while they learned the art of slow trust. Amani, who had given a whisper that altered a man's life, grew into a presence that changed the family's texture. She became a small household historian of sorts,
writing notes on scraps, Emma's left shoe in the blue basket, and tucking them into June's apron pocket. Elias began to keep a jar by the kitchen door where they would deposit small things found on walks: a shiny rock, a tea tag, a bead. The bracelet with the missing bead was kept in a small velvet box, now in a drawer that smelled faintly of cedar. It was a relic that the children would one day examine with adult curiosity. There was no neat moral finished in a sentence. The life-altering encounter had been that, a single event that changed the direction of many lives, but it did not erase the need for counsel, for therapy, for work. In the quiet evenings, Elias sometimes went to the cemetery and left lilies, though less out of ritual and more as an act of ongoing memory. Fred, the cemetery manager, never asked for explanation. He would nod and place his hand on Elias's shoulder like a stitch. At the house, the wisteria swung lightly in spring wind, and June hung a small wind chime by the kitchen window. It made a delicate bell that spoke to ordinary weather, an auditory marker for the life they were creating. The girls played in the yard under the shade of the trellis. Amani taught them a new game called bridge, inspired by stories she told of sleeping under a bridge and passing the time by naming ships on the river. The game was harmless and funny in a way that made Elias laugh, tears leaking at the corner of his eyes, not from sorrow, but from a tenderness that had grown patient. One evening, as the family sat around the kitchen table, pancakes cooling into syrup moons conspiring with a thin layer of butter, Elias looked at the small group and felt a steadiness he had not expected. They spoke about trivial things. Who would wear the odd socks? Who would be on dish duty? Sophie argued for 2 extra stories before bed as a legitimate compensation for setting the table. Emma doodled a compass on a napkin. Amani, who had once been a whisper that upset the ordered script of Elias's life, reached across the table and took his hand in a small act of friendship. They were not saved in any miraculous sense. The law had its results. The guilty had been held to account in ways a court could quantify. But the more honest sense of recovery was the slow rebuilding of domestic trust, the mornings that matched the nights, the steady attendance to small needs, the willingness to show up for one another without a ledger. Outside the estate, the city continued to hum, some corners gentler, some corners crueler. But inside a kitchen with worn wooden chairs and a wisteria that now bowed with the weight of new leaves, there was a life that had been altered and, precisely because of that alteration, made possible. Years later, the police files would gather dust in a cabinet. The headline photos would be archived. But the thing that changed everything, the small, improbable whisper spoken between headstones on a fogged morning, remained a held memory, a moment that proved how a minor voice could reroute the course of lives. Amani, now older by a few years and still prone to a certain wry smile, often said little about the choice she made to speak up. Someone had to, she would say, and that was enough. On a late spring day, when the wisteria was in full purple thrall and the wind chimes sang on a small breeze, Elias walked the path to the river with Emma, Sophie, and Amani at his side. They paused by an old bench where, years before, Elias had once sat alone. He placed a small bouquet of lilies on the bench as a way of acknowledging both past loss and present life. The 3 children ran ahead and disappeared into a strip of sunlight by the boatyard. Elias watched them go, their small shoulders, their laughter like soft knocks at a well, and he felt how fragile and how firm a life could be when rebuilt. If this story moved you, leave a comment about a small voice that changed a life you know, because sometimes the quietest things carry the greatest consequence.